Welcome to POS 571, Study Session 8, Contemporary Western Theory of the State. Introduction. In this study session, you will be exposed to the contemporary Western theory of the state. Learning outcomes. After you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Discuss contemporary Western of the state. 2. Explain 3 grounds on which classical theory of democracy has been criticized. 3. Discuss how to trace the existence of democracy in the state. Contemporary Western theory of the state. At the center of this theory of the state is the notion of democracy. A useful approach to discuss this element of the contemporary Western theory of the state is to adopt the formal definition of democracy offered by D. Miller. He argued that democracy as applied to political institutions of the society requires that political power should reside in the hands of the entire people, rather than in the hands of one man or small number of persons. One of the strongest critics of democratic theory is Joseph Schumpeter, an economist, sociologist, and political scientist, in his book entitled Capitalist, Socialist, and Democracy. He launched an attack on the democratic theory by offering words in contrast to Miller. In his word, Schumpeter stated, "The democratic method is that instrument, arrangement for arriving at that political decision in which individuals have power to decide by means of competitive struggle for the people's vote." In this submission, it was discussed that while Miller offered us a maximum definition, what Schumpeter offered was a minimum definition. Criticisms against classical theory of democracy. Schumpeter and several other writers after him, including Huntington Samuel, had criticized classical theory of democracy on several grounds. The first critique says that classical democracy theorists assumed a level of rationality among people that is not present in real life. For example, the classical writers assumed that people have views on issues that affect them and then go on to choose those that will carry on their wishes. In the words of these critics on the assumption, what electoral study has shown was that people tend to be propelled more by prejudice and other rationality, impulse when they make such political decisions, as those involved in voting tend to display a very low degree of rationality in such matters. Also, the critics argued that voting studies have shown clearly that there is little logical connection between an individual's view and how he votes. Instead, what such studies show is a process by which people yield to irrational prejudices rather than logic. The second argument is that further evidence from voting has shown that voting behavior is not a matter of individual decisions, since the individual tends to be subject to the views of its community or peer group. As was quoted by Schumpeter, what we find is not a genuine but a manufactured will. The third attack was the one which emphasizes the role of crowd psychology. Critics further argued that there is a general absence of contrary to what classical theories suggested, that there is a general presence of autonomous, individual observations and interpretation of political life. Instead, what is often manifested as voting behavior is the psychology of the crowd. According to critics, another failure of classical democracy is that it makes it difficult for us to distinguish between a democratic state and a non-democratic state. Classical theory is accused of utilizing such concepts as people's power and general will, which critics considered as not being precise enough to serve as a clear guide in any attempt. The critics further accuse classical theories of not taking sufficient account of the factor of leadership. They equally accuse the classical theorists of not recognizing that it is the leaders who develop, mold, and express the will of the people, determining the existence of democracy. In determining whether democracy is present or not, this can be argued by examining how those who exercise power actually came to power either through competitive election. Then we can determine whether we have democracy in place or not. Schumpeter's statement on democracy: the primary function of the electoral process in any democratic state is to produce a government, while democracy seems as an institution processing mechanism for controlling the government. This kind of approach offers us a closer perspective from which we can determine to which democracy is present or absent. In recent times, it became increasingly clear, however, that Schumpeter's criterion of competitive multi-party election is no longer adequate for separating democratic from non-democratic states. It has been discovered by many writers that in the late 1980s and 1990s, the situation in several African, Latin American, and Asian countries has shown that many autocratic regimes invest a lot of resources and energy to create the appearance of democratization in spite of the deepening reality of undemocratic rule. The period, therefore, witnessed an increasing trend of an autocratic rule that appropriated the language and symbols of democracy, that is, competitive election, to frustrate democratization and deepening authoritarian rule. Similarly, in one of his articles, Larry Diamond in July 1986 inquired into the future of what Huntington characterized as the third global wave of democratization. Summary: in this study session, we explored the importance of democratic rule. In a democracy, every individual is given the right to exercise his or her civic duties. This makes everyone compete for political leadership in the state. It is also assumed that this kind of democratic system will ensure political freedom. However, the classical theory of democracy has been criticized on some grounds that the assumption of rationality is fictional, its lack of clarity, and for underemphasizing the role of leadership in a political process. End of study session 8. Thanks for listening.